explorer, pioneer, hero.
We were very, very surprised at the amount of attention that that flight got. It just sort of caught hold, and everybody sort of all around the world was watching, was experiencing it right along with us.
A conversation with John Glenn, next on Mainewatch.
For all the people of Maine, this is Mainewatch, Maine's only statewide issues and debate program.
Welcome to Mainewatch. I'm Barbara Caridi. Few people in the last half-century have deserved the title of American hero, but John Glenn surely qualifies. Veteran, explorer, political leader, his record is hard to equal. Senator Glenn was in Maine back in May to give a speech at the University of Maine. He sat down with Don Carrigan to look back and to look forward.
Senator Glenn, thanks very much for taking the time to be with us.
Glad to be with you today. Thank you.
For people in my generation, certainly, and many others, I mean, you're a hero in a whole variety of ways. I'm sure you've heard that many times, but we first knew you as the astronaut, so I'd like to ask a few questions about space to start with. First of all, if they called up tomorrow and said, will you take another flight, would you?
I'd be there. Annie wouldn't agree with that necessarily, but no, I think actually if there was something in particular they wanted to find out as a result of the last flight, if there was something they wanted to follow up on that was important, would I be willing to go up again? Absolutely, I'd love to go up again. Mm-hmm. But that isn't the way it should go. Right now, we only have experience with one person in my age bracket, and that's me. But absent some specific interest in me, the flights should go to somebody else in this age bracket, so we build up a database that's more meaningful.
You spoke a little bit about, in your speech at the University of Maine, that America has not turned its back on space travel, but certainly seems to have lost the excitement over it.
We get excited about the firsts, and we do that in a lot of things, I think. It's not just we get excited about a brand new computer that has new capacity or something or other. And I think the first, Al Shepard's first suborbital flight, my orbital flight, Frank Borman's Christmas Eve flight around the moon, Neil Armstrong stepping off onto the moon, all these were firsts that were followed by other flights. And the other flights may have been just as productive, but they don't get the same attention as we're so accustomed in this country to having so many new inventions, new experiences, new things, new standard of living, new cars, new whatever, that I think we pay attention to the first event, and then we tend to ignore it from there. It's too bad that's the way it is, but and yet some of these other flights have developed a lot in the way of research that is of benefit to everybody right here on Earth.
But it isn't really the research that captures people's imaginations, is it?
No, it isn't, but it should be, because that's what really changes lives right here. But the first, where people go up and do something that hadn't been done before, that seems to that gets a lot of the attention.
And your flight captured people's imagination in a way it almost seems even greater than the moon flight did.
Well, it was greater than that, because there was a lot of attention on the landing on the moon. But the flight I was on back in 1962 was something that I won't say we're shocked, but we were very, very surprised at the amount of attention that flight got. It just sort of caught hold, and everybody sort of all around the world was watching, was experiencing it right along with us. I think some of it may have been a contrast with the Soviets at that time, because the Soviets were secretive. They were going up. They'd announced they had something going around the Earth, all like that, but they kept it a secret.
Right.
And President Eisenhower, to his everlasting credit, decided that our program would be open, and we'd share our information with different nations, and they would share in our agony or our defeat, or our successes and our defeat, whatever, and that's the way the thing was run. And so people sort of emoted along with us, and there were so many times it was scheduled, then it was off, then it was scheduled, and it was off, and I went on the 11th scheduled date, and so that made a lot of build up and down, and so people sort of were hoping we could do this thing, and it got attention that surprised even us.
How vivid are those memories in your mind today?
Very vivid, because it's been a rare day since then that someone hasn't brought up something about the flight, and plus it was a very memorable event to to take part in to begin with. So it was sort of impressed on my memory indelibly. But then the fact I've recalled it so often, I think, has kept it very fresh. I can remember what it felt like on my back during re-entry and things like that, sensations you expected or didn't get when you thought maybe the thing was going to burn up or whatever.
You were a seasoned combat pilot, a test pilot, as well as an astronaut. And I'm sure you've been asked this 100 times, but as you're being sent into orbit, were you scared?
Not scared to the point where you let it. When you say scared, people think you're clutched. You're really one step from being out of control. Not scared like that. Were you apprehensive because of what was going on? Yeah, you bet. If you hadn't been apprehensive in a brand new experience like that and dealing with the power and the speed and looking forward to re-entry and things like that, if you weren't apprehensive, I think you're too numb to be up there. You shouldn't be selected in the first place.
It's a lot to worry about.
But as far as just flat scared to the point where you're tense and you're letting it overcome you, I had trained a lot for that flight, as the other astronauts had for other flights too, and that's the best way to take away fear, is to feel that you've done every bit of training you can possibly do in being prepared to do something. That's true in everyday life for you, me, or anybody else right here.
Was it as good as you thought it would be?
Yeah, it was. It was. We tried to think what it would, but it was really something to get up there and be into orbit and detached from the booster, and there I was, and then get a go that we were going to go for the whole mission, which they had to give me the go on. Otherwise, we had to retrofire and try and get back down in the Atlantic. And so that was the best word I ever heard, I guess, was your go. So that was good.
Moving up a couple of decades, you're worried now about education in this country. And you said in your speech at the university that you're concerned particularly for the quality of math and science education in elementary and high school. Why?
Concerned about education, but in particular about math and science education. The TIMS study, as it's called, the Third International Math and Science Study, came out about 2.5, almost 3 years ago. And it showed that our kids in the 41 nations that were studied, lengthy studies, the 41 nations that were studied, our kids up to about the 4th grade almost lead the world. They're in the top 2 or 3 nations as far as math and science go. Now, when you get beyond that, and by the time they get out of high school, they're almost last. They're in the bottom 2 or 3. This is average for the whole country. We're almost in the bottom as far as the math and science capabilities go. Now, we're no longer competitive just from Maine to San Diego or just across this country. We now have to be competitive around the globe if we're going to still have the lead, be a leader among nations as we have been in the past. All the things that go into making businesses and entrepreneurship and investment come from math and science. Curious about a camera here or a whatever, how can we design a better chair? Or can we cut that granite or whatever it is, or plastic or something there, can we cut that differently? All the progress we make has some basis in math and science. And so if they're leading us around the world, then that doesn't look good for the long-term future. Let me just continue a minute here. Dick Riley asked me to set up this commission, which we did. We had some leading educators and business people, high-tech people, as to what was going on here. Now, we met for over a year last year, made our report last October to then Secretary of Education Riley. What we found was that across this country, the average is that in math teachers, 25% of them are teaching out of field. They never had a major or minor in that subject.
Yet they're teaching.
And yet they're teaching, so teaching out of field. 20% of the science teachers are in the same situation. 30% of our math and science teachers leave the profession in the first 3 years. So we don't have we don't have the kind of teaching that we should have. How do you correct it? Well, all other nations that are our competitors have a nationwide school system, and that's it. And they support it as a nationwide school system. They don't tie it to a property tax or something else. It has a nationwide school system. In our country, there is no system. We have K-12 education is carried out by 14,700 school boards, not directed from anybody, but independently elected, independently operating, and that's our school system. And if I had gotten up in the United States Senate and suggested a nationwide school system and taken away local control, I'd have been run out of town before I got the words out.
Yep.
But yet the local people in many places, many of these school boards are not doing the job they should do. And that's what we're encouraging them to do.
Okay,
Yeah.
let's say you can go into, meet with any school board from a town or a school district in Maine, representing a community like those in Ohio and every place else that has tax problems and other issues. What do you tell that school board?
Tell that school board they're going to have to up the pay for the teachers if they want to keep them. And they're going to have to require higher qualifications of the teachers. Going to have to require them to have majored or minored in that subject in their own college days, so they have some preparation to be teachers. I think they can set new standards. You can set new standards for the kids. You can make sure that the advanced courses are there in high school. You can make sure that good basic math is part of that core curriculum in the high school. There are all sorts of things like that. And in our report, I guess I spent too long flying because I wanted a checklist for everybody. And so I made in our report, we made checklists for the major stakeholders in this field, superintendents and school boards, principals, parents, local legislators, state legislators, federal legislators, people like that, who are all going to have a say in some of this in correcting what is a very bad problem.
You mentioned the notion of national, some sort of national education system. Yet local control of education is almost a holy grail for a lot of people in this country.
It is, but along with that holy grail, it may be that people want that, but they also have a responsibility then to provide the kind of education our kids are going to have in the future if they're going to be competitive with our worldwide competitors. We're now globalized. We know, you wake up in the morning and you see on the TV the Wall Street quotes, the Hang Seng Index, the Nikkei average, the Frankfurt quote, Zurich, euro dollar, indicating tens of billions of dollars going around the world overnight, looking for places to come to roost to invest in research and entrepreneurship, and where they have a good qualified workforce, which they are going to be outdoing us on unless we get our act together in this country.
Do you see a move toward greater federal government, either investment in education or control over education? Or
No, I don't think so. Right now, a lot of people seem to think that the federal government provides the money for our K-12 system. They don't. It's about 6%.
Right.
And most of that's in things like school lunch programs and things like that. It's not really, the federal government doesn't control solid education. Now, the federal government is a very major factor in higher education with Pell Grants and loans and student loans and the research support to colleges and universities, things like that. The federal government plays a major role. And we'd think it was awful if they got out of that. Yet we don't want to get the federal government for some reason, into local schools, and yet the local school boards are not doing the job they should do. I'm not proposing a bigger federal role, but I'm saying the local school boards better shape up, or we're really endangering our future. And I think it's that serious.
Yeah. You also mentioned something that you think is, if not a danger, at least a risk, which is people losing interest in public service, particularly government service. Yeah,
I do, and it just hurts me when I take a different view of public service and running for public office than many of our young people do, who look at politics and government as, oh, they wouldn't participate in that. I don't want to be involved with something as dirty and filthy as politics. And yet, politics is so important. I used an example this morning, I guess, of if we could all go to Washington and be at the National Archives building and go in and look at the Constitution. There it is, the greatest single document in governance ever written in human history. Evolved a lot of give and take and push and tug and haul, and worked out over a number of years and argued about for many years after that, leading up even to the Civil War later on. But it still is the greatest single framework of government ever put together to provide not just protections for each individual, but opportunity under that framework for each individual. And to me, I view politics as being the personnel system for that Constitution. And if we're not going to have people brought into it in support of that Constitution, if we're not going to do it by our political system now, then how are we going to do it? And I don't find any higher calling, maybe other than the ministry, that is higher to me than being willing to work in government, either work in government or run for public office, run for elective office, to fill those spots where you represent other people,
How do we get
That's
people
a
into
trust.
it? Oh, is it just that people are so much busier than they used to be? Has public's at least elected service been somewhat discredited by people in my business, or what is it?
So all the above, I guess. I think some of it has been discredited, and there have been plenty to discredit. But there are things wrong with every profession. There are things wrong in the broadcasting profession. There are things wrong being a banker, lawyer, an insurance salesman, or whatever. And there are things wrong in government we should be working to correct. Campaign finance reform, John McCain's efforts, what I was a co-sponsor of when I was still in the Senate. I think that's one big first step that would do more to engender faith and trust in government than almost anything else we could do right now, because people have a feeling that too often government or decisions in government, decisions by politicians, are affected by the money in politics. And I'm sorry to say that a lot of times I think they're right. And so we need to correct that, number one.
How did you ever feel the effect of money? Was it just that people who donated got more access to speak to you? How did that reflect in your own life and career?
Did in my own life, in that I was aware that some of these things might happen. A couple of times when people offered a large campaign support, that they would be willing to raise certain amounts, and I knew there was a quid pro quo connected with it, or I thought there would be. Well, I just turned that down, and I'm glad I did that. But I think where you have things, it's not all the individual though. Where you have the parties, for instance, back in the election before last, one of the parties, and I don't want to get political and big argument here, but one of the parties was advertising that in their brochures, make a $100,000 contribution to their particular President's Club, whatever it was, not the name of it, but to support them with a $100,000 contribution. You could have a meeting with the committee chairman of your choice for breakfast, lunch, or dinner. Now, if that isn't a blatant situation, I don't know what is. Now, that changed in the last election. Now it was $250,000 for a breakfast, lunch, or dinner with the committee chairman of your choice in the Congress. Now, if that isn't government for sale, I don't know what it is.
I've never talked to a candidate or someone who actually won elective office who doesn't despise the process of raising money. Yet it seems so often that neither party really wants to change the system, or they just want to change it in a way that'll hurt the other guy.
Well, things have evened out a little bit here recently. The efforts at campaign finance reform in the Senate were supported unanimously by Democrats, and John McCain on the other side, who was the sponsor of the legislation, Russ Feingold, and over on the Republican side, there were, I think, 2 or 3 others beside John McCain on that side. When it came up for votes, we had the votes, and the Democrats voted solidly for campaign finance reform. Now, in the last election, what happened was that the amount, and this was at least in part in the past, because the Republicans were able to raise more money than Democrats. Now, in the last election, Democrats were raised almost the same amount of money as Republicans, and so this time around, when it came up time to vote for campaign finance reform, Democrats were basically, but there were a lot of people talking about jumping ship on that and maybe going over on the other side. So it didn't have quite the same solid support that it used to have when people didn't think there was any chance of that happening. So the voting patterns are still basically the same. John McCain passed with all the Democratic support, and basically with that, and with a few Republicans over there also. But that's basically the lineup that we have right now.
And you're convinced that passage of campaign finance reform in some way will make a big difference in at least make a start in getting people to go back into public service?
McCain-Feingold, if that legislation is passed, it won't solve all of our problems, but it's a start. It's a big start.
I wanted to get back to a little more personal, if I can. On your shuttle flight, you were, as you mentioned a few minutes ago, you were dealing with a variety of experiments and issues related to aging. Yet you're closing in on 80, I believe, and you don't seem to have aged very much. Closing fast. And you don't seem to have aged very much.
Oh yeah. Well, when I get up in the morning, I feel I've aged about as much as anybody, I guess. But I try to take reasonable care of myself, and I try and get some daily exercise. I think that's very important for anybody that may be watching this. If you the best way to keep yourself going is to exercise and exercise your body. And I try and do that every day. I do a little light weights and then get out and do. Doctor recommended about 15 years ago I stop jogging, but do fast walking. Get out and just walk as fast as you can take. Get your heart rate going, get the sweat up. And I try and do that maybe 5 or sometimes 6 days a week.
How tough was the training for the shuttle flight? Was it hard?
Well, NASA doesn't have any required training for that as far as physical go. What they want is for you to be able to pass a physical when it comes up time for flight. And if you want to go swimming or running or jogging or fast walk, whatever you want to do to stay in shape, well, that's okay with them. They don't get you out in the morning at 5 o'clock and run you down the road boot camp style.
That probably was all right with you.
That was all right with me, so I continued the same kind of training I've done all these years.
You know, there is a link, obviously, all kinds of links between aging and public policy. With our population growing older, here in Maine, it's particularly growing older. Is that something we ought to worry about?
Very much so. And you know, they started an Institute of Public Service and Public Policy in my name at Ohio State University after I sent all my papers and things there. And one of the things I'd like to study there is the impact of things we haven't talked about much in aging. All the emphasis on aging seems to be how do we make the elderly, how do we keep them healthy to an older age so that everybody doesn't wind up in nursing homes. But there are a lot of other things here that I think we're going to have to consider, like changes in housing patterns. How do you take care of the elderly that are retiring at 65, but they may live one of these days up into the 90s as a norm? At the beginning of the last century, just over 100 years ago, the life expectancy in this country was 47. Now it's 78 and going up. And it's going to be, very shortly, life expectancy will be about 80 in this country within a very few years. Now that means when you have people who are going to be living in retirement, say, unless we up retirement ages, up Social Security ages and keep people working longer, it means you're going to have people retired longer. What do you do for housing? Do they move in with family? Are there going to be other homes? What kind of facilities? There are a lot of problems here we have not really yet addressed, and it's a problem that's coming on us very, very rapidly. It's a worldwide problem because some other places there are a few places around the world that are even better than we are as far as this Japan, for one, where they have their life expectancy is ahead of ours right now.
Does the aging of the population, is it a threat at all to the education issue? People not wanting to give up their share of the pie?
Yes, but how do you, if we're going to retire people earlier, then are we going to have an increased Social Security? Where does that come from? Where do we pay for that? How do we pay for it? Are you going to make the people furnish more of their own retirement?
Or just work longer?
Big questions. Or work longer. Instead of a normal retirement age and start a Social Security being at 65, should be up 67, working its way up towards 70, something like that. These are all things we have to debate out and deal with because they're coming.
I've got just a couple minutes left. I wanted to steer back to one final space-related question. You've had a career and a life that are almost unparalleled. It seems you fought in 2 wars, flew over 150, I believe, over 150 combat missions. You're a test pilot, an astronaut, U.S. senator, candidate for president, an astronaut again, and now you're still active researching and working on education and other issues. It's got to be more than just luck. What quality about you, and I know you probably hate to do this kind of thing, but what quality about you, more than any other, has allowed you to succeed in so many ways?
I don't think there's any one thing I could put my finger on, and I've been very fortunate having a lot of opportunities come my way. And Annie and I have, every time something came up that was an opportunity, we've talked it over and decided to go with it, whatever it was. And there have been a lot of things like that happen. But you know, every young person today has advantages of education, for instance. University of Maine, right here, has a university education that these things are unparalleled. I wish I could go back to school. I'm not likely to go back and try and get another degree at college or something at this age, but I would love to go monitor courses and learn new things. I think that's, to me, if people are learning and looking ahead and have an attitude toward living at each day they live, they are looking forward to trying to accomplish something. Seems to me that's the best way to have a productive old age. That and keeping the body going with exercise. But the people I sort of almost feel sorry for are people who Well, here I am 65. Now I'm expected to be a couch potato, so I will. And pretty soon they're gone, and that's it. And the best thing I think for a healthy old age is mental attitude of looking forward to doing things, not always looking back, and keeping the exercise going.
So is there anything you haven't gotten to do yet that you want to do?
I would like to go back up in space again, but Annie says no. But but as we said earlier, if they want to know something in particular, would I be willing to go? Yeah, I sure would.
Okay.
Yeah.
Senator Glenn, thank you very much for taking the time.
Thank you. Enjoyed it. Thank you.
And that's Mainewatch for this week. Thanks for joining us. For Don Carrigan and the Mainewatch team, I'm Barbara Carritti. We'll see you next week.